Okay, let's get started. So today we're going to be talking about privacy and anonymization. This is going to be, I think, one of the more interesting lectures as well. And we've been especially excited to deliver this lecture because me and Philip actually have a background, small background in this. So today I'm going to be first covering some of the basics of anonymity, then some ways that you can de-anonymize, like whatever identities on the blockchain. And then we'll talk about mixing with an emphasis on decentralized mixing. And then we'll talk about some of the anonymous altcoins and initiatives, and then conclude. Okay, so what's anonymity? Blockchains are not anonymous by default, because if you think about it, essentially what you're doing with a blockchain is you have some central database and you're distributing it, and everyone has a copy of it. So that means you can't really control read and write access to this database. So most of these blockchains are pseudonymous, meaning that you use an identity that may or may not be tied to your real identity. So in Bitcoin, that would be your Bitcoin address. On Reddit, your pseudonym is your Reddit username, and people may or may not know like whether that username is tied to who you are in real life. So when we talk about linking in the context of anonymity, it's talking about associating one of these real-world identities to a pseudonym online. This is also called de-anonymization. And with Bitcoin best practice, you can actually achieve a small degree of anonymity. And the basic idea is that, okay, every time I receive Bitcoin, I'm going to use a new pseudonym. So it's kind of like every time you comment on Reddit, you use a new account. And this is partially effective, but through some techniques and simple analysis, you can derail that pretty quickly. So anonymity also isn't absolute, or generally it isn't absolute. It's not a clear yes or no how anonymous you are. So there's a notion of degree of anonymity or level of anonymity, which is basically how difficult is it for some attacker or some adversary to associate your pseudonym with your real-world identity. And if you've achieved some high degree of anonymity, you can have a reasonable expectation of privacy. But why is this important? Why do we need privacy in a distributed system? So naturally, the question that everyone asks is like, you only need anonymity for buying drugs, right? So I'm going to go through several scenarios of a blockchain-based world where it might be a big problem. So first scenario, Bob's Burgers. You make a purchase at Walgreens, and this cashier looks you up on blockchain.info and sees 20 purchases a month to the address that's publicly tagged as Bob's Burgers. But everyone knows that Bob's Burgers is actually the world's biggest porn site. A little more extreme example is if this same cashier, when they looked at your account on blockchain.info, they see that you're sitting on a $60 million stash of Bitcoin, or they see that you are Satoshi Nakamoto. Well, when they kidnap your mother, they know exactly how much money to extort you with and how much to ask for. For example, here's another example. If you go to a restaurant and this restaurant refuses to split your bill, you're like, okay, my friends can just pay me, it's whatever. Well, after you get your friend's Bitcoin and you go to Bob's Burgers to try to make a purchase, they don't accept your payment because it says, oh, your Bitcoin is associated with drugs and money laundering and illegal activity through their analysis tools. So this plays to this idea of fungibility, which is basically that every unit of a currency and every subunit of a currency need to be equivalent. Otherwise, that breaks the property that that can function as a currency. And then a last example is, suppose we're in a future where blockchain is ubiquitous and you can actually run a business purely on the blockchain. So you founded a hot new startup called BitBlock-based CoinPay.cash, and you want to keep up to date with your competitor. So you go to your competitor and buy one of their products, and then you're like, oh, crap, I just gave them all my transaction history. So now your competitor knows all of your customers, all of your operational expenses, how much revenue you have, and they might be able to deduce your secret business strategy like based off of the purchases that you've made in your recent past. So the conclusion really here is that if you have a lack of anonymity, anyone you've transacted with ever is able to see a full history of everything you've ever done and into the future as well. So this is definitely a big problem that we need to resolve. But addressing some of the ethical questions of anonymity. Obviously, like when you have anonymous cryptocurrencies, yes, it does enable money laundering and online drug purchases, illicit activity. But you can also think of a partial solution as just pushing all this regulation to the edges. Wherever this cryptocurrency interfaces with a fiat currency, that is a very highly regulated area. So for example, when you go on an exchange and all you want to do is exchange cryptocurrencies, the only thing they really require of you is like your username and maybe your email. If you want to trade US dollars or euros, as soon as you want to get into a fiat currency market, they suddenly ask for things like passports, IDs, birth certificates. So it's also really hard to implement morality at a technological level because the use cases for both good and bad activities on a blockchain look the same from a technological standpoint. So the end question is really, do these positive benefits outweigh the costs? And one thing that we can look to for inspiration is Tor. So as many of you know, Tor allows for anonymous web browsing. And it was actually created by the US government. And it's caused a lot of issues for law enforcement. But they found other ways. And in the end, the government decided that Tor should stick around because it enables reporters in oppressive regimes to maintain their freedom of speech. So let's take a look at some basic de-anonymization techniques. The techniques that I'm going to be describing in this section are primarily de-anonymization via transaction graph analysis, which is basically you have this blockchain full of data. Let's look at this blockchain and try to find out something from that. And remember that the goal of de-anonymization is to link some pseudonym with some real-world address. And part of the way to that goal is you need a cluster, meaning, like for example, in Bitcoin, best practice is to use multiple addresses. Well, clustering is to attribute multiple addresses to the same entity. And then the last step is to associate this entity you've identified as with some real-world identity. So clustering. In Bitcoin, there's two main ways to associate these addresses. So the first is where you're merging transaction outputs. A typical example is our coffee shop example, where it requires 0.05 Bitcoin. If you have two unspent transaction outputs, one is 0.02 and the other is 0.03, you need to combine those in order to get the total 0.05. And it's a reasonable assumption that the two outputs that are being combined belong to the same person, because rarely do people make joint payments for some shared product. And then the second way you can really identify this is through change addresses. So if instead you had a 1 Bitcoin UTXO and you needed to buy this coffee, well, 0.05 would go to the coffee shop and the 0.95 would go back to you. The key thing to notice is that one of these is a change address. And one way you can tell what the change address is it usually has never appeared on the blockchain. So someone trying to de-anonymize you and cluster your change address with the output address can just simply look for the new address and associate those two addresses together under the same entity. And in both of these diagrams, it would just be A and A prime being associated to the same entity. So now that we've associated our entities, how do we actually tie these to the real world? So in the case of services, there's several techniques. You can transact with a bunch of them. Like you go to everywhere online in the ecosystem, make deposits, make withdrawals, make purchases, whatever. And then you simply wait for the transactions that you've made to be merged into one of these clusters. And then you've thus identified that cluster as being Coinbase or Mt. Gox or whatever. Another way you can do it is by looking at the transaction graph itself using some pretty data visualization tools. So right here is a transaction graph of Bitcoin back in 2013. And in 2013, Mt. Gox was a huge part of the Bitcoin ecosystem. I think they comprised of 10% of all Bitcoin or something. So you can see this giant purple dot. Another service that existed was Satoshi Dice, which is a gambling service that allowed for small denominations, but you had a lot of transactions. So that's why the dot is really small and you see a lot of outgoing edges. Now, as for identifying individuals, all you need to do is send them some Bitcoin because by default they need to give you an address of theirs, right? Another thing you can do is you can write a web crawler that goes through forums and looks for people asking for donations, and then thus you're able to associate their forum username with some Bitcoin address. And then the last thing you can do is you can go to companies, service providers. There's a company called Skyreef, which was previously known as Coinalytics, and their goal is to build the Bloomberg of Bitcoin, so to speak. And one of their products is this compliance AML product where they run some analysis to see if your funds came from illicit activities and money laundering schemes. So how would Coinalytics actually do this? They employ a technique known as taint analysis. And taint is basically the idea that you can measure the percentage of funds received by an address traced back to another address. And how you do it is you have some database of known addresses, and you tag those addresses as, okay, these are the bad addresses. You assign a taint of 100% to those, and then you're able to propagate this across the transaction graph, weighted by the transaction amount and the amount of taint that it has. So up here in this diagram, you can see if you start with 100% taint and you just go through a number of intermediate nodes without mixing any clean funds, it's going to stay at 100% taint. So this kind of foils the naive mixing strategy of, oh, okay, if they've found this pseudonym, you know what, I'll just send it to a bunch of other pseudonyms, but those other pseudonyms also have 100% taint. And you can see as the more clean funds that we mix in, the cleaner your money gets until you get down here to 11.11% taint, which is probably clean enough for you to be able to spend it on legitimate services. But as soon as you add in dirty funds again with a high weight, then you can't spend those funds again. So here's a screenshot of the taint analysis. Oh, yeah.
When I clicked on Silk Road, were they able to track everyone who interacted with the site and graph to them?
They can track the addresses that sent to Silk Road. Yeah, but they wouldn't necessarily know the identities behind those addresses. Yeah. And then as for taint analysis, this is a screenshot of blockchain.info. They actually have a taint analysis tool where you can pick some addresses, inputs, and outputs, and see how associated they are. All right, so now we're going to be talking about mixing.
Yeah, so we've kind of motivated why anonymity is necessary. Now we're going to kind of look at how we can intentionally transact to obfuscate the origins of our funds. And so we'll start by looking at kind of the real world for inspiration. Typically if you have like $200 million in drug money, or you have like some corruption kickbacks or something, you want to take that dirty money and you want to basically clean it and get clean money that you can now spend freely. And how you do that usually, or like in this case, you might create hundreds of shell companies, maybe in the Bahamas or something, and you start like depositing money over time. And those shell companies like write those off as like investments or whatever, like wages. And then those shell companies like send to more shell companies, and you get this like whole like obfuscated trail of money until eventually you basically try to reintegrate the funds into the actual like economy. And at this point, once you're in the integration stage, you've got hopefully clean funds. Now, what we're going to be looking at from the digital mixing standpoint is this like layering step, basically where we're creating a bunch of transactions that are made intentionally to hide the actual origin of the funds and try to mix in like clean funds again.
Yeah, so we need to establish a somewhat formal framework for thinking about anonymity, and we'll be building this up as we walk through the protocols today. So first we need to define what an anonymity set is, and it's basically the set of pseudonyms between which some outside attacker can't distinguish an entity from their counterparts. So for example, if you're in a mixing group, all the peers in your mixing group are typically considered your anonymity set. And the main goal of mixing is to maximize their anonymity set, make it as large as possible. So one of the ways to do this is to conduct multiple rounds of mixing, because at every round of mixing, it exponentially increases your anonymity set, assuming that you're mixing with different groups and not just the same group every single time. And this is effective, except for that there are some real-world constraints. Most notably that there might not be that many people mixing, and selection bias, where all the people who are mixing probably are doing illegal things anyway. So really, the larger, keep in mind, just remember, the larger the anonymity set, the harder it is to de-anonymize or relink your pseudonyms. There are some other additional properties that we probably want in a mix. First off, it needs to be trustless, meaning there's no counterparty risk. It's just no one is able to steal your funds, and that's pretty important in a Bitcoin world where if they manage to hack your client or whatever, they actually get money instead of just like data that they have to then convert into money. And we also want this to be plausibly deniable. So it shouldn't be obvious from your transaction history that you're mixing. Otherwise, if someone accuses you of a crime and they see, oh, you've been participating in mixing transactions, that looks really sketchy. That could count as evidence against you.
So to actually go about mixing, we kind of classify mixers into 4 categories. We have kind of centralized mixers, altcoin exchange mixers, and there's decentralized mixing protocols where multiple people cooperate, and then privacy-focused altcoins, which are different blockchains that have a focus specifically on coin privacy. So the first case, and really the most basic, is the centralized mixer. Essentially what you have is Alice with her dirty inputs, and she deposits these inputs into the centralized mixing service. This is a third-party, trusted service. And then later, she specifies an output address over here, and then sometime in the near future, the centralized mixer sends different unlinked coins to the output address, and usually takes a mixing fee. So the key here is that this transaction chain leading from this input to this output inside the service is totally disjoint from the other transaction chain leading over to the output. And in that way, Alice's transaction chain is broken, and so people trying to follow the transaction chain don't know where it went, essentially. And so, this seems like it might work, and it does, but there are some issues. Does anyone know what those issues might be? No? Okay.
How does it model charging fees? How does it model charging transaction fees?
It depends on which service you use. Some of them do a percentage cut. Some do a flat rate. It really depends. But the key issue with these centralized mixing services is that there's counterparty risk. And so for the duration that you have your funds deposited in the service, that service could renege and then steal your funds. You basically have to trust that the service isn't going to run away with your money. There's also the issue of reduced anonymity because the mixing service might be recording the input-output mappings, and in which case they know basically where the funds are going, and so they can de-anonymize you. And there's also the centralization risk where it's one service and it could just be shut down. The FBI could send a takedown notice, or they could install their own logging. So that's really not good. Another kind of naive mixing strategy is what we call altcoin exchange mixing. So basically you start off with say Bitcoin or something, and you go through incrementally several different altcoin exchanges. So you convert your Bitcoin to some amount of Ethereum, and you do this over and over again, until eventually you get say Zcash, and you convert that back to Bitcoin. And so you have hopefully clean coins in Bitcoin. And the key part here, the part that's actually doing the anonymization, is that these are disjoint transaction trees, and even more, they're separated by different, entirely different blockchains. So an adversary would have to follow you somehow through the exchanges and through the other blockchains through those transaction mappings. So that definitely provides better anonymity. And it's also better for plausible deniability. Because with the centralized exchange, it does look kind of sketchy when you're sending funds to a known mixer, law enforcement is like reading your like transaction history, like, oh hey, he's like intentionally mixing. That's probably bad. With altcoin exchange mixing, it's not obvious because it looks like you're just doing normal currency exchanges. Of course, there's still some the same issues with counterparty risk, where the exchanges themselves could be hacked or steal your funds. You also rely on the exchanges themselves holding your mapping secret. And also, a lot of the exchanges have to comply with like KYC AML, like know your customer, anti-money laundering laws. So usually you have to provide like passports or IDs, which would tie your transactions back to you. So we're going to look at another class of mixing called what we call is decentralized mixing protocols. This is basically where you have a kind of a separate like overlay network on top of Bitcoin of peers that actually like cooperate to create an intentional set of like transactions that obfuscates or anonymizes their coins. And hopefully we can do this without having to have a trusted third party. Instead, it's decentralized, so there's no single point of failure, no middleman that could steal your funds.
Yeah, so can this be done? This is the question that me and Philip actually tried to answer through a project that we called the DMix project. And our goal was to build a trustless, decentralized Bitcoin mixer that maintains plausible deniability. We also wanted some additional requirements to make it practical. First off, it needs to have low fees. The fees can't be cost prohibitive, as opposed to some other protocols that usually use fees as a mechanism of burning money and disincentivizing attackers from attacking this mixing protocol. And we also want it to be Bitcoin compatible. So we just talked about altcoin exchange mixing. I mean, this is all fine, but it's also really a really manual process. Is there a more elegant way we can do this? And especially given that Bitcoin is going to exist for a while, it would make sense to try to come up with something for Bitcoin. So let's build DMix. Well, whenever you're designing a decentralized mixing protocol, there's a lot more nuance to it than just the standard anonymity properties that you want. So more formally, a mix is comprised of inputs and outputs. And remember that the goal is to hide the mapping from these inputs to the outputs. And there's also a definition of correctness as applied to a mix. And that's basically that coins can't be lost, stolen, or double spent, and that the mix must be truly random with no way for an attacker to bias the randomness or otherwise de-anonymize the mix. And it also must eventually succeed in returning the funds of the honest users, meaning that like even if someone halts a protocol, people are not going to just lose their money. They're going to get their money back somehow, eventually. So there's several adversarial models as well by which we analyze these mixing protocols. There's 3 types. The first is the passive adversary, which is some adversary that's outside of your mix, just outside on the blockchain, observing whatever. And the key thing and the basic level of anonymity is that these passive observers cannot be able to determine the mapping from inputs to outputs. There's also a semi-honest adversary, where you have an adversary that's actually participating in the mix with you. They'll actually correctly follow the protocol of the mix, but they might try to analyze the network data, analyze the cryptography to try to deduce the mapping and de-anonymize your mix. But the thing is, the semi-honest adversaries generally don't try to steal your funds. Now, there's also the malicious adversary, which is the toughest adversary. They're a part of your mix, and they can do whatever they want. Like, they're not bound by your protocol in any way. So they might want to send false messages. They might abstain to vote. They might not communicate, whatever. This is kind of analogous to the idea of Byzantine fault tolerance, where even if everyone in your mix is malicious, you need to be able to get your funds back somehow. So there's also this definition of civil resistance. We've brought it up multiple times in the rest of the course, but in regards to decentralized mixing, it's a lot more nuanced. So there's 2 types. First is resistance to stealing funds. So some implications of this is that you can't rely on partial threshold cryptography. You can't rely on M of n multisig, where M is less than n. So basically, you need n of n signatures for any threshold cryptography, and your protocol must be able to execute correctly even if every other person that you're mixing with is a malicious adversary. You also want to be resistant to de-anonymization. So a weak resistance is that the passive adversaries can't determine the mapping, but participants within the mix or semi-honest adversaries can be able to determine this mapping. And that's kind of a problem because if you know of this mixing service, this mixing protocol, to de-anonymize the entire protocol, all you need to do is get one symbol in each group and just observe the mappings. And that destroys the anonymity of the entire network. So what we want is a strong resistance to de-anonymization, where even participants within the mix do not know the mapping of inputs to outputs. However, if you have a high proportion of Sybil peers within this mix, they can actually reduce the anonymity set. Because, for example, if you have a mixed group of 30 people, if you are 26 of those entities, then you can basically nail down, okay, there's only 4 possible addresses that this input could be mapped to. So now Philip's going to talk about some protocols.
So first we're going to talk about kind of a more basic primitive we call Coinswap. That was coined by Greg Maxwell on like a Bitcoin forum post back in 2013. And the key idea here is, what if we could make a natural extension of a centralized mixer? So a mixer that can't steal your funds, basically. And so he outlines this protocol. It basically works with some special, like, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar, but like hash check lock time verify, 2 of 2 multi-sig kind of transactions. It uses like 2 escrow transactions and 2 redemption transactions to basically mix funds through a centralized mixer without having the mixer be able to steal the funds. And that was kind of hand-wavy, but the key point is that you can have this like central party, like in the centralized mixer slide, that will actually mix your funds and not be able to steal it. So again, there's no the good thing with this is there's no counterparty risk. The mixer can't steal the funds. There's also decent plausible deniability because the 2 of 2 multisig transactions that actually end up on the blockchain look pretty similar to a decent number of other transactions on the blockchain, so they kind of blend in. The issue, though, is that the values of the transactions, the values going in and out of the mixer, are not hidden to the mix. So, and also the mappings are not hidden to the mixer. So the mixer will eventually learn the input-output mappings. And it's also kind of expensive because it uses 4 transactions per mix round. So an extension on top of Coinswap is basically creating a centralized mixer, except the cool part is that the centralized mixer can't steal the funds, and they never learn where the funds actually end up. And how that kind of works is you have this, you say you have Alice with her dirty funds, she deposits it in the mixer, and that basically gives her the mixer gives her an anonymous voucher worth like 1 Bitcoin, for example. And later, Alice can either give that anonymous voucher to a friend or from, like, say, a different IP or something. She can redeem that anonymous voucher for 1 Bitcoin again. And so the key part is that these anonymous vouchers are constructed in such a way that they are totally identical to one another, except they can't be forged and they can't be double spent. And so they do that in a kind of hard to explain way, but it's basically like some RSA, like probabilistically checkable proof kind of thing. The important thing is that they essentially show that you can build this kind of blind mixer, which is pretty important. There's another kind of classification of mixing primitives called CoinJoin. So what CoinJoin is basically taking, say we have n parties that want to mix their transactions together. They all decide on a common amount, say 1 Bitcoin, and they cooperatively create a single transaction, taking all of those inputs and then creating like say n outputs of each equal amount, and each party owns one of the outputs, except from outside of this like mixing group, some adversary trying to trace like say the A input to the A prime output doesn't know which one is the A prime output because they are all like equivalent essentially. So in that way, this CoinJoin style transaction gives you like an n-sized anonymity set by blending in your coin with n other identical coins. And so the key thing with this construction is that the funds can't be stolen, and there is no centralized mixing party like in the Coinswap or Tumblebit that needs a liquidity pool in order to provide anonymity. So one issue though with CoinJoin is that it's not particularly plausible or plausibly deniable, and the reason why is with these kind of CoinJoin style transactions is they really stand out on the blockchain. When you have like 100 inputs and then 100 like exactly 100 outputs, all of the exact same amount, it really does stand out. And so in that way, it's kind of easy. It's easy to develop heuristics to find these CoinJoin style transactions, and they're also not denial of service attack resistant, at least in this particular protocol. And so one interesting application of CoinJoin was Join Market. Basically, they created a free market for CoinJoin like market makers. So if you have a bunch of Bitcoin that you think is clean, you can create a join market like order book thing, I guess. And basically, people can mix their coins in with your coins for a fee that you charge. It's kind of interesting, but there was a paper that came out recently that showed you can, with 90% probability and only about like $35,000 in cash, de-anonymize the entire join market like marketplace, and you get the money back afterwards. So that's not good. That brings us to another style of decentralized protocol called CoinParty. The key idea with CoinParty is that we want to basically prioritize plausible deniability. So the question we pose is that can we create a mixing protocol where the transactions that end up on the blockchain look exactly like normal Bitcoin transactions? So just, like one input, one output, totally normal, no like crazy coin join or 2 of 2 multisig. And so the question is this even possible? It turns out it is, with the caveat that they have to, at least in this construction, they have to sacrifice some protocol security because they use what's called a threshold multisignature, a threshold signature scheme, where the threshold is like 2/3. And what that means is that if we walk through this protocol, in the first step, we have the commitment phase. Basically, you have these inputs. These are like the input peers, and they create a transaction to these escrow addresses. And this like dotted circly thing is basically saying that this is controlled by the mixing peers. So in order to spend any of the escrow addresses, 2/3 of the mixing peers need to cooperate in this like 2/3 threshold signature scheme. And then the next step, the output addresses that the input peers have specified are basically shuffled in a secure, verifiable manner. And so in that way, they like go through these steps to shuffle up the output addresses. And then the last phase, if everything else is like gone correctly, they do the actual transaction where they move the escrow funds into the outputs that have been shuffled. And so in that way, what actually ends up on the Bitcoin blockchain is just like input to escrow addresses, which just looks like a normal transaction, and escrow to output, which also looks like a normal transaction. And so the key is that this gives us very good plausible deniability, but the big downside is that the 2/3 threshold signature means that if you basically spawn a bunch of like civil peers, you can pretty easily and without much risk take over the mix and steal all the funds. So that's not good.
Another cool thing I thought might be worth pointing out is that in this middle stage where you're mixing the funds, the people don't actually know the mapping from inputs to outputs. So it's using a technique called a Decryption Mixnet, where basically you take everyone's public keys and then you first encrypt it with someone's public key, then encrypt it with the next person's public key, and then the next person, so that the onion layers of encrypting can only be decrypted by a particular order of participants in the mix. And if you do this in a particular way using secure multi-party computation, you're able to, you get this algorithm that generates a output, like the person that you're supposed to like send your funds to, without any of the other people knowing what your output was. So yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so some cool like crypto magic. Yeah. So yeah, it gives us good plausible deniability. It's decent efficiency because it only requires 2 transactions per input per round. The big downside though is the Sybil attack vulnerability and the reduced protocol security.
All right, so we've looked at a lot of the components in decentralized mixing. I want to wrap up our demix project with something that we dubbed the swinger protocol. So this is the last iteration of our project, and basically we leverage the idea of, okay, coin swaps allow you to do atomic trustless swaps, and then the mixnets allow you to find a permutation among a group of people without any of the participants knowing the full permutation. So what you do is you form a pair with someone else in the mixing group. You designate one as the husband, and you designate the other as the wife. So now you execute this decryption mixnet algorithm that outputs another pair that you're supposed to swap with. So you send the wife over to that pair, and that wife performs Coinswap with that husband. In return, you also get a wife that the husband swaps with. So then you just want to abort the protocol if you got no wife or you got 2 wives. Then that's how you tell that someone is cheating. This actually comes pretty close to meeting the design goals of our demix project. It's trustless. Malicious adversaries cannot determine the mapping, but the end conclusion is that this isn't as anonymous as a naive mixing scheme where you just pair up with someone random on the network and attempt to mix with them. Actually, forming this group makes it less anonymous because it allows some attacker to pinpoint, okay, this is the group of people that you're mixing with. And if they get a lot of Sybils into your group, they can basically de-anonymize the mix. So this is still an open problem. No one's designed a protocol that meets our specifications. So the conclusion here is that building a good decentralized Bitcoin mixer is pretty damn hard. Now there's also some privacy-focused altcoins.
So the key idea with privacy-focused altcoins is that up until now we've been focusing on mixing like on the Bitcoin network, but really the Bitcoin network gives us very difficult. It's a difficult environment for mixing due to the reason that we laid out. So some people came up with the idea to create altcoins that have like an anonymity built in by default. So one altcoin is like Dash. I guess you explain it.
Oh yeah, so Dash basically has this network of masternodes that have privileged rights to help run services like voting on proposals, confirming instant transactions, but most importantly, they execute CoinJoin together as a network. So when you join the Dash network, your wallet by default includes you into this anonymization procedure. So your funds are sent to the masternodes where they execute CoinJoin a bunch of times and they're sent back to you. And the funds that you now have been unlinked. This has no issue of plausible deniability with CoinJoin. Because previously we were talking about, okay, there's 50 inputs, 50 outputs. That's really obvious on the blockchain. But in Dash, everyone is participating in these CoinJoin transactions. So your anonymization transactions are indistinguishable from the rest. There's some cons to Dash. The main criticism of Dash is that the network itself isn't secure, and that you can essentially buy masternodes. To set up a masternode, you need to put down a deposit of 1,000 Dash and keep that deposit locked there. And presumably someone can get a bunch of money and just buy the masternode network and de-anonymize everything.
Yeah, it's another like kind of privacy-focused altcoin is Monero, or it kind of builds on the CryptoNote algorithm. And what these CryptoNote altcoins do is they use what's called basically ring signatures. What a ring signature does is that you have like, in this context, like a set of outputs of which one is yours, and you can create a signature from this set of outputs that proves that you own one of the outputs without revealing which specific output that you own. And so in this way, something like Monero, what you do when you create like a transaction is you select a bunch of previously created outputs, add that to your like ring signature, and then from that you can spend like your output, and basically from the outside, and like a passive adversary would only see that one of these like specific outputs was yours. So in that case, you have an anonymity set of the previously selected items in the ring signature. And so that gives you a decent anonymity set. And it's also nice in Monero because you have anonymity by default. So this happens by default, so there's no plausible deniability issue. But the question is, can we do better? Like, can we get a better anonymity set? And so the next kind of iteration of privacy-centric altcoins is Zcash. And they rely on a pretty bleeding-edge cryptographic primitive called a ZK snark, or a zero-knowledge succinct non-interactive argument of knowledge, which is kind of a mouthful, but it's basically like crypto magic, which lets you create proofs that basically let you prove that you know something without revealing anything about what you know. And how we translate that into like cryptocurrency stuff is basically if you have like or I guess one additional point is that Zcash works in like a layered system. So there's the base coin, which is basically identical to Bitcoin. And then they have this Zcash black box. And in this black box, all of the transactions are totally anonymous by virtue of the proof system. And how you like basically take your base coin, the Zcash base coin, and you mint it in this like mint procedure to create a black box like coin. And then you can like in full anonymity transact these black box coins. And then the cool thing about that is that the input-output mappings of these transactions in the black box are totally hidden, and the input-output values are also totally hidden. So it's really like this crazy crypto magic where everything is fully anonymous. There is no way to like correlate or distinguish between transactions or their values. There is like timing attacks that you can do, but that's much more difficult in this system. And then once you have like a black box coin that you want to basically redeem into the base coin, you do what's called a pour to get the base coin. Of course, not everything is great in Zcash land. Everything is like pretty much fully anonymous if we assume that the cryptography itself is valid. And the issue is that this is like very bleeding edge, like basically published like a few years ago on how to do this. So hasn't been exactly peer reviewed fully, so you have to kind of trust that. The other issue, like more practically, is that the ZK snark proof system they use is very resource intensive. So it requires like basically 4 gigabytes of RAM and around 2 minutes of computation on like a modern Intel CPU or something to generate these proofs for these poor transactions. So that's not something you want to be doing on like your mobile phone. The other big issue that's kind of been resolved, but is that Zcash requires this semi-trusted one-time setup. What that means is that in order for these ZK snark proofs to function correctly, you have to do a one-time like cryptographic setup. And one of the issues with this setup is that it generates these like toxic parameters, and if the setup executes like properly, they discard these toxic setup parameters, and everything's fine. However, if an adversary gains access or knowledge of these toxic parameters, they can actually mint black box Zcash or Zcash coins without having to put in like base coins. So they can pretty much print money. So the key here is that, at least how they describe in the Zcash like launch thing, is that they set up like a secure multi-party computation where the toxic parameters could be generated and only recovered if I think n-1 of the like generation peers colluded. So that kind of mitigates the one-time trusted setup, but there's always the issue that someone might have saved it and colluded. And just to give like some notes about like current events, the Zcash currency actually launched last Friday, and the price swing was crazy. It basically went from like about $100 per Zcash to like $15,000 per Zcash in the span of like 3 hours, and then basically fell down again to like $200 per Zcash, and now it's back up at like $1,000 per Zcash. And at least my hypothesis is that they had a certain mining distribution. Basically, they didn't do a pre-sale or a pre-mine. They just like let it out into the world, and people had to like mine it from scratch. And in that way, there was like a huge supply-demand mismatch, basically. And so the price was like crazy. But if you're trading like Zcash futures or like options trading, you probably made or lost a lot of money on Friday.
Okay, so there's some, let me see. There's some just last caveats. So a lot of these have been mentioned, kind of, but generally, okay, you want to avoid side channel attacks where with all these protocols, you want to be executing with Tor for everything. But keep in mind that these exit nodes might also be adversary controlled. And remember that we also want to keep a consistent transaction amount. So if you have an input of 1337.6969 and it outputs 1337.420, that might be a little bit suspicious. So there's also timing correlations. So humans often act in predictable ways. You can kind of like guess what their mix or input might be based off of the timing of their actions. So the solution to that is that all client software for these mixing protocols need to be automated. And then lastly, there's like network level de-anonymization. One example of this is if you receive a transaction on the Bitcoin network, it is most likely that the person who sent it to you is the original sender of that transaction. That's just like a basic heuristic. So in conclusion, a rough comparative level of anonymity. Bitcoin's like pseudonymous. We go to centralized mixers, then all our decentralized mixing protocols. And then Zcash is definitely the most anonymous and the one that promises like true, like pure anonymity. And to leave you with a practical note, if you ask me how would I mix my coins today, my answer is that I would actually do altcoin exchange. And I would do it through Dash, Monero, and Zcash using throwaway email accounts and throwaway exchanges, all connecting to each exchange with Tor and a VPN while changing the IP address between each exchange. You also want multiple exchanges so that even if two of them collude, they can't de-anonymize you. Question.
What are you doing with Bitcoin?
No. Not going to answer that question. Okay, so next time we'll be talking about scalability. Our homework's just an easy take-home quiz. The readings, there's a 50-minute video on the Lightning Network. That's what we really want to focus on because it's a really, really cool protocol that's going to basically make Bitcoin feasible and decentralized tech feasible for our future. There's some optional reading, like Mimblewimble, which was a new blockchain design written by Voldemort. CoinParty paper is a good way to introduce yourself to some cryptographic engineering techniques like the Mixnet, secure multi-party computation, etc. And then the only other thing is that for Blockchain at Berkeley, we're having our interviews, and our first meeting is next Monday. I believe that's it. Yeah, I hope you guys had a good introduction to anonymity. So thank you. Yeah.